Bjorn Eriksson's feet had forever lost their former color and warmth. The harsh January of 1342 brought Arctic cold to northern Norway, with temperatures plummeting to zzz. The 17-year-old peasant found himself trapped in an icy tomb, spending 14 agonizing hours buried under the bodies of his relatives in a tiny hut, measuring just 2.4 by 3.6 meters, 8 by 12 feet. His father was pressed against his back, as if trying to warm him. His mother's frozen breath settled in icy crystals on his neck, while his 3 younger siblings, still and lifeless, weighed down on his ribs. Yet, Bjorn survived. 3 months later, when the winter cold receded, he crawled out of that deadly trap, having lost 2 toes and most of his left foot. On his back was the only other survivor, his 4-year-old sister, Astrid. This was an exhausting war against nature itself, waged by people armed only with knowledge passed down through 30 generations of peasants. They learned to cheat death in a world that sought to freeze them to the bone. These were not the Vikings we see in movies, with their long ships and raiding parties. These were farmers and fishermen, forced to survive through long months when the sun disappeared below the horizon and temperatures dropped so low that spit would freeze in the air before hitting the ground. How did these people manage to survive in conditions that would prove fatal for a modern person, even equipped with the best winter clothing money can buy? How did families, deprived of any heat source other than their own bodies, endure nights that lasted 20 hours in places where the cold could kill in minutes? The answer lies in a practice so shocking that it's difficult for a modern person to comprehend. But for the Viking peasants, it was a matter of life and death. With the onset of the first frosts in October, entire families would strip naked and huddle together like animals, creating what they called a heat pile. The largest family member, usually the father, would lie at the base. Then the mother, followed by the children, from oldest to youngest. Infants were pressed against the bare chests of adults so that their hearts could warm the smallest bodies. When someone died during the night, the survivors did not remove the body. Viking peasants discovered that a dead body retains heat for about 6 hours after the heart stops. So, when a family member died from cold or hunger during those endless winter nights, the survivors kept them pressed close, extracting every last bit of warmth from the deceased's body. Astrid, daughter of Magnus, a peasant from the Orne Islands, wrote in 1356 about sleeping with her dead husband for 3 consecutive nights during a 9-day blizzard. She described how his skin turned gray, then blue, and then black, but she could not afford to lose the heat his corpse still contained. Only on the 4th morning did she push away his frozen body, its outline forever imprinted in her memory. But she had survived another night. Viking peasants studied the thermal zones of the human body with a precision worthy of a modern thermal imager. They knew that the chest generated the most consistent heat, the armpits and groin intense but short-lived heat, and the feet and hands sacrificed themselves first to preserve vital organs. They positioned family members accordingly, treating each body as part of a complex survival mechanism. The person in the center of the pile, usually a pregnant woman or the sickest family member, remained in that position all night. The others moved in carefully devised patterns that were practiced during warmer months. Parents knew how to shift their weight without waking the children, how to breathe to maximize the heat of exhaled air, and how to position their hands to maintain blood flow in their limbs. A family of 6 could keep each other alive for up to 18 hours at temperatures as low as 34 degrees C, 29 degrees. But adding just one more person meant the weight would crush those at the bottom, cutting off circulation and causing death within 12 hours. Removing one person meant that heat loss would kill the remaining 5 within 14 hours. The Viking peasants knew these numbers because they had tested them on their own lives for many generations. The additional heat generated by pregnancy could help a family survive, but the growing child inside required more calories and heat than the mother could generate. Historical records from Iceland indicate that in the winter of 1348, 63% of pregnant women died from cold and hunger, but their unborn children provided enough additional heat to save their families. Women knew this when they made the decision to become pregnant during the harvest season. Viking peasants discovered that raw seal, whale, or pig fat generated more heat than cooked meat. So, in the coldest months, they ate kilograms of pure animal fat. A typical peasant consumed up to 8,000 calories a day in winter, with 70% of those calories coming from pure fat. Their stomachs swelled like balloons, and many vomited from the enormous amount of fat, but the fat burned inside their bodies like fuel in a furnace. In harsh survival conditions, the human body became a kind of furnace, where every drop of heat was valued like gold. Fresh human urine, retaining a temperature of about 37 degrees to 98.6 degrees, for almost 20 minutes after leaving the body, served as a kind of mobile heater for the Viking peasants. They collected it in animal bladders or clay pots and pressed it against their chests and abdomens, transferring precious heat from one family member to another. Children were taught from a young age to control their bladder so that on command they could warm those close to freezing. When frostbite became a reality, the Vikings resorted to terrifying measures. With knives heated in the fire, they cut off frozen sections of flesh to stop the spread of damage. These amputations were performed without anesthesia, perhaps with the aid of alcohol, which was too valuable to waste on pain relief. Historical chronicles attest to cases where peasants cut off their fingers and toes, and sometimes entire limbs, to prevent deadly gangrene. One account tells of Olaf, whose wife cauterized his wound with a red-hot iron rod while their 3 children held him down. Olaf lived for another 22 years, crawling, but considered it a victory because his entire family survived that winter. In extreme survival conditions, the Vikings' body temperature dropped to 34 degrees Celsius, 93 degrees, and remained there for months. This slowed their heart rate to 40 beats per minute, allowing them to survive on half rations. Their limbs turned bluish, then black, and many lost sensation in their hands and feet, but continued to work, eat, and care for their families. Women gave birth in such conditions, feeling nothing but instinct. They learned to deliver babies almost blindly, relying on touch and intuition. The Vikings discovered that sleeping more than 4 hours consecutively in severe cold could slow metabolism to a critical point. Therefore, they developed a system of shift sleeping, where one family member stayed awake, monitoring the breathing of the others, and waking those whose body temperature dropped too low. The on-duty family member maintained warmth by exercising, then shared their heat by pressing against the others. This meant everyone slept only 2-3 hours per night, but constant movement and shared warmth kept them alive. Viking peasants developed a psychological technique they called warm memory. They would spend hours recalling the sensation of the summer sun on their skin, describing these memories in minute detail to each other, creating shared fantasies of warmth that helped them endure the reality of freezing. Children were taught to remember the feeling of warm water, hot food, and sun-warmed stones, and to practice summoning these memories in the coldest moments. Adults who mastered this technique claimed to feel warmer despite dangerously low body temperatures. Modern psychology would call this self-hypnosis, but for the Vikings, it was simply another survival tool. The social structure of survival prioritized sacrifice. The strongest and most experienced family members sacrificed themselves to save children and pregnant women. Elderly men deliberately exposed themselves to the cold, took on the most dangerous tasks, and refused food. This was a calculated strategy based on who had the best chance of surviving until spring. Families planned these sacrifices in advance, training sons to manage the family's survival after the elders' deaths. The dying process itself became part of the survival strategy. Those dying from cold or hunger were positioned to provide maximum benefit to the survivors, lying in the center of the heat pile, using the last hours of their body heat to warm the others. They would consume any remaining medicine or alcohol, then regurgitate it so others could consume it, transferring nutrients that their own bodies could no longer process. Clothing was not used as it is today. Vikings stripped naked and wrapped themselves together in one enormous hide that covered the entire family. These communal coverings were made from bear, seal, or wolf skins and could reach sizes of up to 3.6 by 4.8 meters, 12 by 16 feet. The animals' heads covered the people's heads, and the paws were tied around their feet. But the main secret to the effectiveness of this technique was the unprocessed hide. It retained the animal's scent, bodily oils, and even tissues that continued to release heat through decomposition. A fresh bear hide could provide additional warmth for up to 6 weeks after the bear's death, giving families a crucial advantage during the coldest part of winter. During the harsh winter months, when an icy grip bound the land, Viking peasants faced immense difficulties. From December to March, when all water sources froze, the only way to obtain life-giving moisture was by melting snow and ice. However, they discovered that ingesting icy water carried the risk of dangerous hypothermia, capable of stopping the heart. To avoid tragic consequences, the Vikings developed a unique technique. They would hold snow in their mouths for about 3 minutes, allowing body heat to slowly melt it, and only then swallow the water, warmed to a temperature close to body temperature. This procedure had to be repeated dozens of times a day to prevent dehydration. Often, families would take turns warming snow in their mouths, then spitting the warm water into a communal container so others could quench their thirst. Small children, unable to warm snow themselves, drank water warmed in their parents' mouths. This practice, while undoubtedly contributing to the spread of diseases, simultaneously saved young lives from inevitable death by thirst. Over time, the most successful Viking peasant families developed what they called winter personalities, completely different patterns of thought and behavior that manifested exclusively during the coldest months. People who are normally generous and kind-hearted transformed into cold-blooded strategists, making decisions about food and heat distribution based solely on calculations rather than emotions. Parents, observing their children's suffering, showed no outward signs of concern, understanding that emotional reactions were an impermissible luxury that could cost lives. These learned behaviors were passed down through generations, helping families make the cruel decisions necessary for survival. A mother might coldly sacrifice the weakest child to save 3 stronger ones, and then return to her usual maternal behavior with the arrival of spring. After long months of survival, when Viking peasants slept naked in communal piles, ate raw fat, and drank each other's warmed saliva, they had to return to normal social behavior. However, many failed to do so. Historical records attest to cases of spring madness, where people continued to adhere to winter survival strategies even when they were no longer necessary. Unable to believe that the warm weather would last, some families refused to sleep in separate beds even in summer, continuing to huddle naked, fearing a sudden return of winter. Others hoarded fat and refused to cook food, their bodies and minds forever altered by months of survival mode thinking. Children who survived several harsh winters often never developed normal emotional reactions to cold, hunger, or physical discomfort. Viking peasants who lived to old age bore the scars and mutilations incurred from decades of extreme cold exposure. Their joints were permanently damaged from months of cramped sleep, their digestive systems ruined from consuming raw fat and decaying meat, and their limbs were covered in scars from amputations and frostbite. And yet, the most striking aspect of the Viking peasants' survival was not so much the special methods they employed or the sacrifices they made, but how fully they realized that survival required them to temporarily cease being fully human. They understood that civility was a luxury they could not afford when temperatures dropped below freezing. Therefore, they developed systematic ways to forego human dignity, privacy, and individual identity to keep their families alive. Modern people struggle to endure one night without heating when the power goes out. Viking peasants built their entire lives around surviving conditions that would kill most modern people in a matter of hours. And they did not consider it heroic or unusual. For them, it was simply what people do when winter comes, when the choice is between survival and death. These complex survival systems were developed over centuries by people who understood that nature does not care about human dignity, comfort, or individual survival. Every method they used, from sleeping with corpses to consuming raw fat and amputating their own limbs, was based on meticulous observations and trials that were perfected over generations through trial and error. When the last traditional communities of Viking peasants disappeared in the late 15th century, they took with them human survival knowledge that no modern person possesses. They learned to push the human body and mind to limits that are difficult for us even to imagine. And they created social systems that allowed families to make impossible decisions and still remain loving communities once the crisis had passed. Bjorn Eriksson, who managed to escape the deadly pile in 1342, lived another 53 years. He married, had children, and became a successful fisherman, despite missing most of his left foot. Every winter, with the arrival of the first cold winds, Bjorn gathered his family around the fire and taught them the techniques that had saved his life on the most terrifying night he had ever known. In the harsh lands of northern Scandinavia, where frost bites to the bone and technology proves powerless, there exist communities that preserve the ancient knowledge of their ancestors. They recognize that survival sometimes demands abandoning illusions of human dignity and the value of each individual life. When death from hypothermia overtook a family member, the others resorted to a cruel but necessary method. They made small cuts on their limbs and pressed the bleeding wounds against the icy skin of the dying person. The hot blood, maintaining a temperature of about 37 degrees Celsius, 998.6 degrees, briefly warmed the body, and the iron it contained prevented the spread of frostbite. Legend has it that Gerik the Bloody-Handed survived the severe winter of 1339 by inflicting over 300 wounds on himself over 4 months, when the thermometer never rose above the 29 degrees Celsius. 20 degrees. His family collected the blood in wooden bowls and poured it over those on the verge of freezing. Fire was so valuable that Viking peasants invented ways to generate heat without using fuel. They discovered that human waste continues to emit heat during decomposition for 3 weeks after it is expelled. Therefore, families collected excrement in clay pots and placed them around sleeping areas, using the natural heat of the decomposing waste to raise the temperature in their huts by several degrees. 1 pot of fresh human waste could generate enough heat to save a child from freezing during the coldest hours of the night. Families had a rotation system for caring for the waste pots, and children were taught to defecate on command when additional heat was needed. In extreme conditions, communication with animals took on a new, vital meaning. Viking peasants caught wild animals such as wolves, bears, and large birds, and slowly killed them, trying to keep the animal's body alive for as long as possible to utilize its heat. A live wolf pressed against a human body could save a person from hypothermia. So, families caught wolves and broke their legs to prevent escape, turning the animals into living heaters. Magnus the wolf tamer, in the winter of 1345, kept 12 live wolves in his hut, alternately pressing them against different family members throughout the night. All 7 members of Magnus's family survived that winter, while the rest of the village died from the cold. When a person dies from hypothermia, their body releases stored energy in a desperate attempt to warm itself. This process, known in modern medicine as paradoxical undressing, causes the dying person to suddenly feel intense heat, leading them to remove their clothes and even attempt to go out into the cold. Viking peasants recognized this as a harbinger of death, but also learned to use this last surge of heat to save others. When a family member entered the dying phase of hypothermia, the others piled on them, absorbing every particle of heat released by the dying body. This practice, called death warming, sometimes allowed 2 or 3 family members to be saved, albeit at the cost of the life of the one who gave their heat. Viking peasants discovered that pregnant women emitted significantly more heat than other adults, but also needed more food and died more often during childbirth in conditions of severe frost. Therefore, families collectively decided which women should become pregnant and when, viewing childbirth as a survival resource rather than a personal choice. Women who became pregnant during the harvest spent the winter months in the center of the family sleeping pile, warming everyone with the heat of their pregnancy. However, they were also expected to give birth alone, without assistance, as providing childbirth assistance would require other family members to leave the warm place and expose themselves to the deadly danger of freezing. Historical records indicate that 68% of women who gave birth in winter died within a week after childbirth, but their children provided enough additional heat to increase the survival rate of other family members by 24%. The most successful families developed rotation systems that a modern person would find unthinkable. Each family member spent exactly 47 minutes in each position within the heat pile, timing it by heartbeat or breath. The person at the bottom absorbed heat from everyone above them, but slowly suffocated under the weight of the bodies. The person on top lost heat to the air, but could breathe freely. People in the middle received heat from above and below, but had to remain motionless so as not to disrupt the structure of the pile. From a young age, approximately 3 years old, children were trained to automatically awaken at strictly defined intervals, every 47 minutes. They were to shift to the next sleeping position without disturbing the delicate sleep of other family members. Adults, thanks to months of relentless training, could perform these rotations almost unconsciously. Their bodies, as if programmed, continued to maintain this vital rhythm even when their minds were disengaged. To sustain life, peasant families utilized any available materials they could find. However, the most effective and perhaps horrifying tools for survival were items crafted from human bones. When a family member died during winter, the survivors would, without hesitation, strip the flesh from the deceased's bones. These bones were then used to create implements that helped provide warmth. Hollow shin bones were transformed into excellent vessels for heating urine or blood, offering some measure of heat. Ribs were bound together to form makeshift scrapers for removing ice buildup from inside their dwellings. And finger phalanges became indispensable tools for slicing frozen meat or digging through dense snow. A bone carver named Ragnar, facing the brutal winter of 1341, crafted an entire survival kit from his father's skeleton. His father's skull served as a bowl for melting snow. The shin bones became containers for retaining body heat, and from the rib cage, he fashioned a frame for attaching animal hides to shield against the cold. Alongside physical survival techniques, children were taught psychological methods from the earliest age. Viking peasant children learned to enter trance-like states, allowing them to slow their heart rate and, consequently, reduce their need for food and warmth. This was neither meditation nor a mystical ritual, but a practical training essential for survival in conditions of severe resource scarcity. The most gifted children could slow their heart rate to a critically low 30 beats per minute and maintain this state for many hours. This enabled them to survive by consuming only a small fraction of the calories and warmth typically required. The Viking peasants who endured the harshest nights of the year survived not through bravery, strength, or divine intervention. They survived because they understood that to live, they needed to temporarily transform into something other than human. They developed entire systems allowing communities to collectively undergo this transformation and then return to their normal lives once the crisis had passed. Their story is not a heroic epic or a thrilling adventure. It is a stark blueprint of what people are willing to do for each other and for themselves when the only alternative is inevitable death.